a ridge on Guadalcanal, a night in October 1942. Out in the dark, beyond the muzzle flashes, thousands of men are coming, wave after wave, straight at a thin line of Marines guarding the only airfield on the island. In the center of that line, one sergeant moves between two machine guns that will not stop firing, feeding them, fixing them, holding a gap that should already have been overrun. If his guns go quiet, the line breaks and the island may be lost with it. They do not go quiet. The sergeant is John Basilone, a machine gunner from New Jersey, and the airfield behind him is the whole reason anyone is fighting and dying on this miserable island. Hold the field, and the Americans can keep the Pacific contested. Lose it, and the entire campaign comes apart. Tonight the Japanese have thrown a tide of men at the line to take it back, and the place where they have chosen to break through is the place where Basilone stands. If forgotten history, told the way it actually happened, is what you came for, take 1 second and subscribe. Because what this man did on that ridge would make him famous, and what he did afterward, when he had every reason to stay safe, is the part most people never hear. Now, back to the line. To understand the choice he would make later, you first have to understand the kind of man who would run through gunfire to keep a machine gun fed. In the autumn of 1942, Guadalcanal was the most important patch of ground in the Pacific. The Americans had landed in August and seized a half-built airfield, and from that strip of dirt their planes could threaten ships and bases for hundreds of miles. The Japanese wanted it back at any cost. They poured troops onto the island and hurled them at the marine perimeter again and again, and by October both sides knew the whole struggle for the South Pacific might turn on who held that airfield when the fighting was done. John Basilone had grown up in Raritan, New Jersey, one of 10 children in an Italian-American family, an ordinary boy who was not much for school and itched to see the world. So at 18 he joined the army, and they sent him to the Philippines, where he boxed, made friends, and earned the nickname that would follow him the rest of his life. The other soldiers started calling him Manila John. He served his hitch, came home, tried civilian life for a while, and found he could not settle into it. When the war clouds gathered, Basilone enlisted again, this time in the Marine Corps, because he had heard the Marines would be first into the fight. He took to the machine gun completely. He learned every part of the heavy water-cooled gun until he could strip it and rebuild it blind, in the dark, by feel alone, a skill that seemed like a party trick in training and would turn out to be the difference between life and death on a black night on Guadalcanal. By the autumn of 1942, Sergeant Basilone and his machine gunners were dug in on the line in front of the airfield. The place was a green hell. The heat was suffocating, the rain endless, the jungle alive with insects and disease, and the night so dark a man could not see his own hand. Malaria burned through the ranks. Food was short and sleep shorter, and every few nights the Japanese came, screaming out of the tree line in the blackness, and the line would erupt in muzzle flashes and tracer fire and the shouts of men fighting an enemy they could barely see. This was the world Basilone lived in, waiting for the night the enemy would come in earnest. That night came on the 24th of October. After dark, a full Japanese regiment, thousands of men, and prepared to break the Marine line in one overwhelming rush. They had chosen their spot. Behind it lay the airfield, and behind that the sea. Holding the ground directly in their path were Basilone and his handful of machine gunners, perhaps a few dozen men, with their heavy guns and whatever ammunition they could keep feeding into them. Then the jungle came apart, and the attack began. What followed was a nightmare without end. The Japanese came in waves, hundreds at a time, charging across on the guns, falling and being replaced by more behind them. Basilone's machine guns fired until the barrels glowed and the water in their jackets boiled away. Men fell on both sides. Gun crews were hit and the weapons fell silent, and each silence was a hole the enemy could pour through. Basilone moved up and down his short stretch of line, doing the unthied, and the short stretch of line in the dark, doing the one thing that could keep the gap closed. He kept the guns running. When one of his guns jammed, he tore it open with his bare hands in the pitch dark and cleared it by feel, the skill from training now keeping the whole line alive. When a crew went down, he threw himself behind their gun and fired it himself. At one point, he picked up a 90-pound machine gun, cradling the hot barrel against his body, and carried it to a new position to plug a fresh break in the line. The burns did not stop him. Nothing seemed to stop him. The line bent and held, hour after hour. But the guns were starving. They were burning through ammunition faster than it could reach them, and the supply lines back to the rear had been cut by the attackers who had slipped through the dark on either side. Without more ammunition, the guns would fall silent within minutes, and the line would die. So Basilone did the only thing left to do. He ran, out of his position and into the night, through ground crawling with enemy soldiers, back toward the rear to find ammunition and drag it forward himself again and again, an armload at a time, alone in the dark. And it is worth stopping here in the dark to think about the men coming the other way. The soldiers charging into Basilone's guns were not monsters. They were young men, many of them barely out of boyhood, sent by their commanders to ground straight into machine guns because their orders left them no choice. They came anyway, wave after wave, with a courage that was its own kind of terrible. Most of them died in front of that ridge for a few yards of jungle they would never hold. Bravery that night was not wearing only one uniform. By the time the sky began to grey, it was over. The great assault had broken against the line, and the ridge in front of the airfield was still in American hands. Basilone's guns had held the gap through the entire night. The airfield was safe, and with it, for now, the whole American foothold in the South Pacific. When the Marines later tried to account for what had happened on that stretch of line, the numbers were almost beyond belief. A handful of men and their guns, with one sergeant holding them together, had stopped a force many times their size. For what he did that night, John Basilone received the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor, and became the first enlisted Marine of the entire war to wear it. He had gone to Guadalcanal, an unknown machine gunner from New Jersey. He came off it a legend, his name in newspapers back home, his face about to become one of the most famous in America, and that fame was about to hand him a choice that most men would have answered very differently than he did. The Marine Corps brought Basilone home, and America met him like a returning king. He was sent across the country on a war bond tour, his face on posters and in newsreels, crowds cheering him in city after city. He raised millions of dollars for the war. He was offered a commission as an officer. He was offered a safe instructor's post stateside for the rest of the war. He had already done more than his share, and an entire nation was telling him he had earned the right to be done with the fighting. He hated all of it. The cheering and the speeches and the safety felt to him like a betrayal of the men still out in the Pacific, still dying on islands whose names the crowds could not pronounce. Those men were his real life, and so John Basilone did something the Marine Corps had almost never seen. He turned down the commission, turned down the safe job, and asked formally and repeatedly to be sent back to a combat unit, back to the war, back to his fellow Marines. He kept asking until, at last, they let him go. Before he shipped out, there was one bright thing. At Camp Pendleton, he met a tough, funny Marine sergeant named Lena Riggy, and he fell in love, and they married. For a few months, the most famous enlisted man in the Marine Corps was simply a husband, and then his new unit was ready, and the war he had insisted on rejoining was waiting, and he kissed his wife goodbye and sailed west toward a small volcanic island that the next generation would never forget. Its name was Iwo Jima. The Marines hit the black beaches of Iwo Jima on the morning of the 19th of February, 1945, into one of the worst battles the Corps would ever. The volcanic sand swallowed their boots, and the Japanese dug deep into the island, poured fire down onto the beach from positions the Marines could not even see. Men were pinned and dying at the waterline. Into that chaos went Basilone, a gunnery sergeant now, doing again what he had always done, moving forward when everything said to stay down, pulling spew, the beach stayed down, pulling his men up the beach behind him. In those first hours, he was everywhere the fire was worst. He single-handedly worked his way to a Japanese strongpoint that was tearing his unit apart and destroyed it, then guided a tank through a minefield under heavy fire, on foot exposed so he could get off the beach and into the fight. He was leading a group of his Marines forward across the sand, pushing inland off that killing beach, when a blast caught him. John Basilone was killed in the first hours of Iwo Jima, still moving toward the enemy, still pulling his men forward. For his actions on that beach he was given the Navy Cross, the second highest award the Navy can bestow. It made him the only enlisted Marine of the entire cross. But the medals are not really the point of his story. The point is the choice. He was a man the whole country had agreed could stop fighting, who was safe and famous and married and free to live. And he looked at all of that and chose instead to go back to the hardest place on earth because the men he loved were still there. Years later, a young Marine asked to name the bravest thing he could imagine, thought not of the night on the ridge, but of the choice that came after. He said, "Anybody can be brave when there is no way out. Basilone had a way out, and he gave it back to stand with his people. That is the kind of loyalty most of us only get smaller chances to show. Stand with your people when you could walk away." John Basilone did, twice. Remember him. If your father, grandfather, or anyone in your family served in the Marine Corps, in any war, leave their name in the comments and one thing you remember about them. Not just a name. One thing, the Marines who followed John Basilone up that beach would want it that way. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them, and more men worth remembering.